Last year, to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I made a video about their origin, both in the story and behind the scenes. That video was the first in a series exploring the history of the TMNT. In that video, I detailed how Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird met, created the Turtles, and found unexpected success in the comic book direct market. But how did a two-person self-publishing studio go from being the underdog to becoming a successful comic book publisher with a $60 million franchise? Well, today, I dive into how Mirage Studios expanded after the success of the first TMNT issue, setting itself up for one of the biggest marketing storms of the 90s. Join me in this new series I'm calling History in a Half Shell. When Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird created the Turtles in 1983, they never expected the comic to have a second issue. Publishers had rejected them all along, but perhaps because of its catchy title, the comic became an overnight success in the direct market. The increasing demand for more Turtles kicked off the black and white comic book boom, with many other self-publishing studios trying to imitate their success. It was clear that the Turtles were scratching an itch that mainstream publishers didn't know existed. Given how TMNT #1 went from being a novelty item to a collectible in just a matter of weeks, the decision to publish a second issue was a no-brainer, and the creative duo started brainstorming ideas to expand their little universe. However, Kevin and Peter were artists, not corporate executives, and this informed their links to their community. For example, after seeing their ad in the Comic Buyer's Guide, artist Michael Dooney sent them a letter, offering to trade their TMNT #1 for the first issue of his upcoming comic, Gizmo, published at the time by Chance Enterprises. Kevin, Peter, and Michael exchanged comics, and a friendly relationship started that would later become an important part of the studio. But in any case, the creative duo pushed themselves into a corner when they did the first issue. They killed off their main villain, and the story seemed pretty much over. The sequel came out in October 1984, with an initial print run of 15,000 copies, quite the jump from the original 3,000. Issue number 2 introduced two significant characters to the TMNT lore, April O'Neil and Baxter Stockman. April was named after Kevin Eastman's girlfriend and future wife, April Fisher. Early sketches envisioned her as an Asian woman, but the character's ethnicity ultimately remained fluid.
She was a big inspiration for that character, at least in name. She didn't look exactly like her. She did in later issues.
Some artists, including her creators, depicted her with darker features, while others portrayed her with lighter ones. This variation wasn't an oversight, but rather a result of the artistic freedom allowed at Mirage Studios, since all the interpretations were approved by Kevin and Peter. However, after a few adaptations depicting her as Caucasian, that became the standard for the remainder of the Mirage era.
Maybe she's like Jesus and she's whatever race you want her to be.
Yeah, I like that.
The real-life April, however, was black, and the legend says that Baxter's looks were based on her father. But making the issue came with some logistical problems, as Kevin was back in Maine. This meant that the whole collaboration had to be done through the mail. The second issue was a success, and after looking at the pre-order numbers, the duo realized they could quit their jobs. By January 1985, Kevin had become a full-time cartoonist. The third issue of the series came out in March 1985, with 50,000 copies. This comic was followed by a series of one-shots focusing on each turtle, the creators branded as micro-series. It was in one of these specials that the Turtles gained a new human ally, Casey Jones, a parody of the grim and gritty anti-heroes of the time. Selling 50,000 copies per issue was an undeniable sign that TMNT was no ordinary indie comic. For comparison, Dave Sim's Cerebus, another groundbreaking self-published series, sold between 30,000 and 35,000 copies per issue at the time, a highly respectable figure for an independent book. Similarly, Wendy and Richard Pini's ElfQuest had gained a loyal following, but by 1985, its success was bolstered by Marvel Comics' color reprints, which expanded its audience through widespread newsstand distribution. While Cerebus and ElfQuest had years to build their readerships, TMNT's meteoric rise in just a year strained Mirage Comics' limited resources. The increasing demand clashed directly with Kevin and Peter's inability to deliver on time. The comic was already bi-monthly, a frequency they found challenging at times, if not impossible. After the 4th issue, they decided to fold their Fugitoid story into the Turtles' lore and improvised a one-shot micro-series special for the character, compiling all the material previously published in Gobbledygook. This gave them a small breather between issues, but it was clear that they needed to expand Mirage to become a real studio to keep up with the increasing demand. Needing extra help, Kevin Eastman invited his longtime friend Steve Lavigne to join Mirage Studios. After convincing Peter Laird, Kevin taught Steve how to letter comics, a skill he picked up quickly and began using with issue number 5 in 1985. Over time, Steve's role expanded to cover whatever tasks Kevin and Peter didn't want to handle, from filling mail orders to coloring. As a side note, while Raphael and Donatello reflected Kevin and Peter's personalities, Kevin has often said that Steve Lavigne's humor was the foundation of Michelangelo's carefree, fun-loving attitude. With Steve's help, Mirage Studios began profiting from their creations in ways most artists working for hire at mainstream publishers could only dream of. This led to the creation of their first wave of merchandise, including iron-on transfers and buttons. And with the merch came also the first licensed products. A company named Dark Horse Miniatures, no relation with the comic book publisher, released some lead figurines of the Turtles and other related characters. The creators had complete creative control and made the drawings for the sculpts. These ended up being sold primarily through role-playing game shops and mail orders. It was perhaps this connection to the RPG world that raised the interest of Palladium Books, a company that specialized in tabletop role-playing games. Their president, Kevin Ciambieta, was fascinated by the Turtles and decided to get a license to publish a game. Kevin and Peter provided the art for the book, now known as TMNT and Other Strangeness, with some of the new characters getting turned into Dark Horse figurines. The RPG book and figurines introduced new fans to the comics, while longtime readers discovered these licensed products, and this cross-marketing helped grow the Turtles' popularity. The success of the RPG book and its sequels would prove to be one of the essential milestones in the path to Turtlemania, but more on that later. Let's focus on the other additions to Mirage's growing team. The next addition to the studio was Ryan Brown, an artist from Cleveland, Ohio, who, alongside his friend Dan Berger, met Kevin and Peter at the American Heroes Convention in Detroit in 1985. Being admirers of the duo, they showed them a sketch they did, penciled by Dan and inked by Ryan. The sketch impressed Kevin and Peter so much that they expressed their intent to hire Ryan in the 4th reprint of issue number 1, even including a pinup Ryan made for them. After seeing this, Ryan called them up, and Kevin offered him a job as an inker. His friend Dan Berger would join the team during the Turtlemania years, but that's a story for a future video. Another addition came in early 1986, when artist Jim Lawson joined the studio as an inker. He got a meeting with the creative duo thanks to a friend who knew Janine, Peter's wife. After looking at his portfolio, they offered him inking duties on the spot for another Mirage book, Prime Slime Tales, with Rowan and Tony Basilicato, the creators of the geriatric Gangrene Jiu-Jitsu Gerbils, the only authorized TMNT ripoff comic. Later that year, he would release Bade Biker and Orson through Mirage. The next addition to the team was someone I already mentioned earlier in this video, Michael Dooney. He impressed Kevin and Peter when they exchanged their number 1 for Gizmo's, so they offered him a place, debuting with a Gizmo backup story on the Michelangelo Micro series. Gizmo received a short-lived comic book series under the Mirage umbrella shortly after that, with issue number 4 reprinting the previous number 1 that Chance Enterprises published before. Unfortunately, the series was cancelled after issue 6. Still, the character returned a few times in many backups and one last miniseries. Dooney's covers were particularly noteworthy for their airbrushed gradients and vibrant lighting effects, which gave his work a polished, professional quality that set it apart from other indie comics of the time. This, blended with other more traditional techniques, contributed to the realism and sharpness of his work. From issues 4 to 7 of the main TMNT series, the Turtles finally discovered their expanded origin story after discovering the origins of the ooze that mutated them. Then, in 1986, the book would peak in sales with issue number 8, a crossover story with Dave Sim's Cerebus that sold 135,000 copies. This experience inspired Kevin and Peter to collaborate with other creators, forming a tight-knit community of independent artists. One of their frequent collaborators, Stan Sakai, debuted his character Miyamoto Usagi the same year as the Turtles, and the two properties would begin crossing over. After the release of the crossover with Cerebus, Kevin and Peter were at a show in New York, where they were approached by Rick Obadiah from a publisher known as First Comics. The duo had recently collaborated with one of their comics, Grimjack, and Rick was interested in collecting the first few issues of the TMNT run, in color, for their graphic novel line. For this, Kevin and Peter took the opportunity to make some corrections in letters and art, and create new covers. Steve Lavigne re-lettered the first few issues, replacing Kevin's original words. This first edition came out in November of 1986, and thanks to its wider reach into bookstores, it ended up becoming the inspiration for the 1990 movie. It also piqued the interest of a very important person in TMNT history. More on that in a few minutes. While Kevin focused on the collected edition, Mirage's growing team took on the TMNT book for the first time on issue number 9. This milestone highlighted the studio's evolution from a two-man operation into a creative collective. The issue was penciled by Michael Dooney over Peter's layouts, inked by Ryan and Jim, and lettered by Steve Lavigne. From the admin side of things, Mirage also hired a young woman named Diane Berube as a business coordinator to help the creatives stay on track of their obligations. To round up this period, it's worth mentioning that by the end of 1986, Mirage published a new gobbledygook, which included art by many of the Mirage artists, but mostly old portfolio stories by Kevin and Peter. One of these stories included art by Eric Talbot, another high school friend of Kevin. Eric would join the studio and become a mainstay of the franchise during the Mirage era. Up to this point, the amount of creative control put on the licensing allowed the creators and fans to be aligned on what the Turtles should be. But not everyone was happy with the changes. Dave Sim, for example, was a purist when it came to self-publishing and believed Mirage's growth risked turning it into a traditional work-for-hire studio, losing the independence that made it special. Nevertheless, Mirage was a fun studio to work at. The new artists that joined Kevin and Peter clicked really well with each other, had fun together, and even learned from each other. To them, it was a dream job, and contrary to what Dave Sim feared, they were getting all the royalties and ownership of their work. At least, so far. Kevin and Peter's dedication to their friends led to the creation of a second TMNT comic, Tales of the TMNT, so the team could continue living and working in Northampton. But I'll cover Tales in the next episode. Nevertheless, licensing the Turtles was risky. Not all deals were good for Mirage. Solson Comics, for example, released 3 projects: TMNT Martial Arts Authorized Training Manual, TMNT Teach Karate, and How to Draw the TMNT, that were so profitable for Solson that they financed a dozen other titles thanks to them. The creators only provided covers for most of those books, except for the How to Draw one, where they provided sketches and layouts. It wasn't a good experience for Peter and Kevin, as they felt Solson was trying to capitalize on the popularity of the Turtles by publishing material of mediocre quality. Kevin got really frustrated after their inker butchered all the detailed artwork he provided for one of the covers, and later wouldn't even give his original art back to him. For Kevin and Peter, it was a frustrating reminder of how easily others could capitalize on the Turtles' success, sometimes more effectively than they could themselves. But perhaps because of the black and white comic book crash, Solson went dormant in 1987, and Kevin and Peter never heard from them again. This experience made Kevin and Peter cautious about future licensing deals. They worried about losing creative control or damaging their young franchise. As a result, they became highly selective about partnerships. If things had stayed that way, the Turtles might have never reached their full potential. Fortunately, history had different plans. I said earlier that the Palladium book was an essential milestone in this story, and that was because Kevin Symbieta offered to connect Kevin and Peter with a licensing agent who got really interested in the Turtles after getting that first collected edition. This licensing agent was Mark Friedman, and he will definitely be one of the main stars of the next episode of History in a Half Shell. It's impossible to quantify the impact of Mark's contributions to the franchise, but one thing is for sure. With the black and white comic crash on the horizon, the Turtles needed someone to help them not just survive the collapse, but thrive. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapter, The Calm Before Turtlemania, where I'll dive into the Playmates Toys deal and the launch of the Fred Wolf cartoon. And in the meantime, leave a comment sharing your favorite artist or story from this golden era of Mirage Studios. Thanks for watching. See you in the sewers.